from the standpoint of the committee, the one from the narrow standpoint of the committee, one interesting thing is that the report states unequivocally what the intelligence community stated, which is that the Russians interfered to benefit Donald Trump's campaign. And of course, when the majority, the then Republican majority, produced a report of the Intelligence Committee's investigation, they said that that was not true. And that's important, sadly, because it indicates that there were some real flaws in the report produced by Devin Nunes. No surprise, but it's good to see. And I don't say that so much to vindicate the Intelligence Committee, but when the Congress says that the intelligence community is wrong in one of their conclusions, that's a pretty big deal. And Mueller, of course, has come back and said that there was, and has in great detail detailed the Russian attacks, and given evidence for their doing so on behalf of then candidate Trump.
So what can we expect from the Intelligence Committee now that you have the report and you can now compare it with what you did before? What's the next step? What will the Intelligence Committee be doing?
Well, I think there's two big categories of things that we need to do. Number one, we need to really absorb the report, because there's lots of new information in that report that we didn't have as part of our investigation. And of course, we don't want to duplicate work that's already been done. Number two, I think we really need to, at the end of the day, the committee is really about oversight. And we need to make sure, now that we have this report, that the FBI and the CIA and the intelligence community, broadly speaking, are prepared for whatever meddling may occur in 2020. I would urge every American to actually read Bob Mueller's report, not to give fuel to your partisan beliefs, but to really look at the detail around how the Russians manipulated racial fault lines, class fault lines, all of the American civic fault lines, to really enrage the electorate. And Mueller's report actually, it shows individual tweets, individual Facebook postings, discusses fake rallies that were, and Americans need to sensitize themselves to that, because no one has any reason to believe that it's not happening again in 2020.
That would be my next question, because we've had an election since the 2016 election. We've had another election just last year. Were there any improvements? How did we handle the influence of foreign influence in the election in the midterms?
Well, I think generally states, assisted by the federal government, have really sat up and taken notice of what happened in 2016, and remember, there's no credible allegations that the Russians got in and messed with vote totals or altered voting machines or anything like that. Nonetheless, state and local jurisdictions, not uniformly, but generally, have sort of been upgrading their game, and that's important. What I think is really important, though, is that individual people, need to understand how they were manipulated. Especially in 2016, you had a presidential election that was decided by fewer than 80,000 voters in 3 states. So, $100,000 of Facebook ads designed to whip up people in very targeted ways could have made the difference. I'm not saying it did, I'm saying it could have. Jim Comey's announcement around Hillary Clinton could have made the difference. In elections that are very, very close, people need to be sensitized to the fact that there are people out there who will manipulate their feelings. And Mueller's report is an incredibly detailed guide as to how the Russians did that in 2016.
Just going back to what you had known before today, for as much as you've read the report, is there anything in there or not in there where you said, boy, I'm surprised that didn't come out, or that turned out not to be the case? Is there something that came before the committee where you said, boy, I see this is going to be a problem for the president, but it's not in there?
Well, so there was a lot that didn't surprise me in the report. I'm not surprised that the Russians undertook a very detailed attack on our election. I'd been involved in looking at that for a long time. I'm not even surprised that the special counsel didn't find that there was a conspiracy between the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign, I should say, and the Russians. I've been on the record forever saying there's not a Hollywood ending here. The Russians would never go to a Trump campaign person and say, sign this contract whereby if you give us money, we'll give you this. That's not the way the Russians operate. They're smarter than that. There was obviously a lot of outreach on the part of the Russians through people like George Papadopoulos and others. There was a remarkable amount of lying about that outreach. So in other words, Papadopoulos, Michael Cohen, Paul Manafort, Michael Flynn are all going to go to jail partly because they lied about contacts with Russians. So I wasn't surprised at the no conspiracy thing. I was surprised by the depth that the president went to try to torpedo the special counsel's investigation. I mean, though he will and wants to claim total exoneration, the extent of his efforts, ordering, Don McGahn to fire Mueller, episode after episode of trying to influence the investigation, that was pretty ugly stuff. Now, Bob Mueller recognizes that the Justice Department has a policy against indicting the president, so he stops short of saying, well, we should indict or we should not indict. But if Congress were in the mind, or of the mind, to impeach this president, you'd have one strong obstruction case.
So it rises to high crimes of misdemeanor?
Well, remember, that's a difficult question because the definition of high crimes and misdemeanors is nowhere written down. So the question is, would the Congress at the time determine that the activity in Part 2 of that report could rise? The answer to that question, I won't speak for the whole Congress, the answer to that question is there is enough gangster-like behavior on the part of the president that Congress could legitimately choose to start the proceedings, to begin to consider articles of impeachment on that basis. And of course, Richard Nixon had articles of impeachment associated with obstruction of justice. Bill Clinton was included obstruction of justice in the impeachment proceedings against him. I don't think that's going to happen. So it's sort of an academic point here.
Why not?
Well, for two reasons. One, the Speaker of the House has said that she's, at least at this point, not interested in going down that path. Even if she were, and even if you could get a majority of the House to impeach, there is no way on God's green earth that the president would be convicted in the Senate. So the answer to the question of could this president be impeached and removed, to me, is an easy answer. The answer to that question is no. So to some extent, this is an academic or maybe political discussion because he ain't going to get removed by this Congress based on the information in the Mueller report. Now, there's other things going on out there, so I reserve the right to sort of circle back on that. But, there is nothing in this report that would cause Republican senators to part with the president. You're already seeing it with their statements on the Mueller report.
It was interesting, you said you were surprised at to what degree he went to try to torpedo this. On the other hand, apparently he's quoted in the report as saying that's the end of my presidency. So he took this. He really thought this was the beginning of the end, apparently.
Well, it's a remarkable thing. If he thought that a special counsel investigating his activities was the end of his presidency, that's the mind frame of a guilty person. If you are innocent and know you are innocent, you would welcome an investigation. And it's been a case study in how to make your own situation worse, because the president, from start to finish here, has acted guilty. From the moment that he fired Jim Comey to today, he has acted guilty, and that has probably made the situation a lot worse for him than it needed to be.
Apparently in the appendix, I guess there's something like a dozen either grand jury proceedings or other investigations that are alluded to. Of course, they couldn't spell out in detail. Any knowledge, anything you can add to that you're aware of what's coming up?
Well, the Southern District of New York is doing a lot of work investigating the president's business dealings. The Roger Stone remains in the process of being tried. I think those are some of the ongoing investigations. The Eastern District of Virginia continues to do some investigations. So I don't have any inside knowledge, but I do know that there are any number of investigations out there that continue, which I think accounts for a lot of the redactions. I'll say one thing. Barr's performance, and when Barr became Attorney General, I remained open-minded and wasn't commenting on Attorney General Barr. His performance has been despicable, and today's performance, in which he, went in front of the press, none of whom had an opportunity to look at the document, was abysmal. What really troubles me was when he went before the Senate and said that there had been spying on the Trump campaign. That's the Attorney General accusing his own Department of Justice of breaking the law. The Department of Justice is not allowed to spy on American citizens. And of course what he's doing is he's repeating one of the president's favorite hobby horses. And so it makes me sad, because I used to think of the Attorney General as a statesman, as somebody who, even if I didn't agree with him politically, was statesman-like. But he learned the lessons of Jeff Sessions. Those lessons are detailed in the Mueller report, and Barr decided that he would rather compromise his own legacy than wind up like Jeff Sessions, and that's it's a terrible thing for the Department of Justice, which I still regard with a great deal of respect.
We've got even more information now about what the Russians did during the campaign. But even up to what you knew previous to today, is there already federal legislation in process that would perhaps further strengthen protections against foreign influence, or is that still in the talking stage?
Well, let me say two things about that, and they're both really important things. Yes, since 2016, there has been money put out to the states by the federal government to fortify and improve electoral security. You can talk to our Secretary of the State about that. Denise Merrill will tell you the efforts that she's made. But the second thing, which I think is almost more important, here's where I think the real value of the Mueller report is, and it's 400 pages and it's hard to read, but it is a roadmap to citizens as to how not to get manipulated and trapped. So, we all hope that the Department of Justice and Homeland Security are doing what they should do, and that local and state registrars and electoral authorities are doing what they need to do. But what that report really says is you can really be easily manipulated by Facebook and by Twitter. So when you see something that lights your hair on fire, step back and say to yourself, this may be somebody trying to manipulate me. Point one. Point two, shame on the DNC and the DCCC, the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, my party's organs, for having lousy IT practices. And again, this is something that citizens and individuals can do. Use two-factor authentication. Don't open phishing emails. So one of the really remarkable things about the Mueller report is that it is a roadmap for citizens to arm themselves against the kind of attack that succeeded in 2016. My understanding is that the Russians over time did a vast swath of phishing, not just of the two political parties, but of nonprofits, of think tanks, you name it. And the initial Russian efforts were not about necessarily helping Donald Trump. That came later. So you have the Russians doing all sorts of phishing across the boards of both parties and all sorts of other organizations. And then when they decide to help Donald Trump, because they decide that's in their strategic interest to do so, boom, you had the penetrations of the Democratic National Committee and so it never, I think, when the time came to really do intense break-ins to networks, they weren't interested in getting into the Republican networks.
How confident are you? Because Governor Lamont seems to be pretty confident after his meeting with the administration's transportation secretary, Elaine Chao, that there's going to be a huge infrastructure bill passed. How confident are you that will happen?
Let's see. I'm I'm a little bit confident. We've started the process, right? The Speaker of the House has reached out to the White House. They've begun talking. I can tell you a couple of things. There is broad Democratic support for what the president has proposed, which is $1 trillion investment in our infrastructure. I don't think there will be any unwillingness to work with the president on that topic. And I'll tell you, I and the Connecticut delegation will be on the tip of that spear, given the challenges we have in infrastructure here. But it's not just us. I mean, you should hear my New Jersey colleagues talk about the tunnel and all that stuff. So, and the president, again, repeatedly emphasizes the importance of this thing. The big question mark, of course, is Mitch McConnell in the Senate. What will he be willing to bring up in the United States Senate? And I think that could be the challenge. Hopefully, the answer is not nothing. I'd rather take half a loaf than no loaf, but I do worry about McConnell.
And if we are going to have such a bill, it would have to be passed this year?
Well, traditionally people say it's really hard to get stuff done in the year before a big election. That may not be true of things like infrastructure investment. It's not true of tax cuts. There are certain things that wherever you are on the political spectrum, you can take home and say, look how good this is for you. And so, again, I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I am optimistic. I've been kicking around Washington long enough to know not to be overly optimistic. But look, I think it could be wonderful for the state of Connecticut. The state is obviously having a robust argument about tolls right now. If tolls were to come to pass, that would be a terrific revenue source. But the state of Connecticut can't do this alone. It's going to require significant federal help. And we need to move now. I probably talk to 3 or 4 business leaders, big and small, every week in this state, and their number one issue is transportation infrastructure.
How did the 4th CT do in the SALT 2017 tax cuts for the corps?
I wish I could give you a good. Let me come back to you to see if we've got good numbers. Anecdotally, I can tell you that that it's been hard on a lot of people. Now, my calls and my emails and my letters have been sad to read, and it's not just wealthy people writing in and saying I'm paying more taxes. It's actually retirees on fixed incomes who were used to deducting $15,000 in state and local taxes, and now they can only deduct 10. So we've gotten very, very strong negative feedback across the income spectrum. Now, again, people don't write me to tell me how wonderful their tax situation is, so I'm not claiming that I know anything other than anecdotal evidence, but it's been pretty hard on a lot of people in this district.
Back to the report, what kind of questions are in your mind now about, what more do you want to find out about Trump's connections with Russia?
There's one category of things that I think are important for the Congress to look at, which are whether Trump was receiving loans from Russian entities. Was the Trump Organization used to launder Russian money? What do I mean by that? There are allegations, I stress the word allegations, that the purchases of condos in Trump Tower, that the purchases of real estate in Florida may have been suspicious. I don't want to look at that as a member of Congress from the standpoint of, gosh, the president did a bad thing, but I do care an awful lot about that from the standpoint of, is the president manipulatable by the Russians? So there is the whole category of banking and business practices and money that we should understand to make sure that the president is not compromised. The other category of things which I think are unknowable are, things like videotapes and behavior when he was there. And again, that's not, I suspect that's not knowable. I think Deutsche Bank is to be examined by the Congress because there's allegations that they may have been involved, and again, allegations. But to me, that's the remaining piece of this. That were there business practices that were improper, such that the president worries that if this is discovered, I'm in a lot of trouble. So I'm going to lean into the Russian. I'm going to lean into Russian objectives.